And now, another message from Off Book. A long, long time ago, we promised you that the next episode would be all about.
The complicated world of remakes and reboots.
However, we were apparently lying, because the week after that, we brought you the first episode of this Off Book Extras about the musicals of Lin-Manuel Miranda. And we told you that next week will also not be on remakes and reboots, but instead on theme parks and what makes them successful. And then, after all of that, you'll finally get your episode on remakes and reboots. However, we were lying then too, apparently, because now this is not an episode about theme parks entirely. You see, this episode is going to be taking a little bit more of a deep dive into a certain element of theme parks, which I'm going to pretend is a reveal, even though it's in the title and the thumbnail. And then next week, maybe, will be a full episode about theme parks, and then maybe, eventually, we'll get to remakes and reboots. Anyway, on with the show. Hello everybody, welcome back to a show that corresponds with another show that is kind of like that first show, but also not really. I am Marc Stoufer III, and today we're going to be taking a little bit more of a deep dive into an element of theme parks and theme park attractions, the good ones, the bad ones, and what I think separates them. This is Off Book Extras. It's a show that's also about Broadway movies, TV shows, and so many other nerdy things, but it'll be a little bit shorter, a little bit more off the cuff, because today I'm by myself and there's no one that can stop me from just rambling into a microphone. For time's sake, I'm going to be focusing mostly on two attractions in Disney: Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway and Star Wars Rise of the Resistance. These are two of the newest rides at Walt Disney World in Florida, and if you don't want to hear how they work or what's going on, you may want to skip this episode, because we'll be talking about it next week. We won't go into details with as much stuff, because it's going to be about more theme park generic stuff, not necessarily specifically attractions, but for this episode I'm going to be going in detail. Now, the reason that I chose these two attractions is because they're very similar in terms of how they work. Both of those rides are what are called trackless systems. So instead of a car with wheels being moved on a track that's on the floor, it's instead a car that moves around on a path programmed by a computer, which allows it a lot of different advantages over a track system, because not only can it do more things because you're not bound to what a track can do, so it can move freely, it can rotate, it can move in more arcs. You also have the ability to not show people that are riding the ride where you're going next, because with something like Rise of the Resistance, the cars will actually break off and go in different places depending on which car you're in, which isn't possible. It is possible with a track, but you'd have to have a switcher that takes a long time to move, so you wouldn't be able to get as fluid a movement. You also have a more fluid overall ride experience because they're kind of floating instead of moving along a track. It also allows for more dynamic moves, and it's more easily pre-programmable if they want to make any adjustments to the ride or want to fix any errors. It also allows, as another benefit, to be able to program in more of a kind of a jerky ride if you're on something like Rise of the Resistance, and so it gives you more freedom and it gives you a better ride experience if you do it right. And I think that Rise of the Resistance is definitely a good example of how to do it right. Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway uses a similar technology in a very similar way, but doesn't do it well, at least in my opinion. I've heard a lot of people like this ride, and that's fine. I'm kind of biased because it replaced a good movie ride, which I think was a really good ride, but I don't like Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. I think the aesthetic of it is cool. I think that it's clear that Imagineers put a lot of work into creating the environments, and I think that some of the environments are even cool, but I thought that the ride experience wasn't actually that good. I felt like it was jerking you around, and so did Rise of the Resistance, but I thought that when Rise of the Resistance did it, it was very intentional. It made you feel like you were more in the movement of transport, you were trying to escape the First Order, whereas I think with Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway, why did both of these rides have such long names? Come on, guys. Why do you... Dumbo, right? Even Dumbo is technically Dumbo the Flying Elephant. Jungle Cruise, that's a short name. Let's call it that. Anyway, where was I? Do I have any sort of understanding of where I'm going? No, I'm alone again. This is why I need a co-host. Anyway, I think that while Rise of the Resistance used the movement intentionally and to help to kind of elevate that experience, I feel like Runaway Railway almost does the opposite, where they program in so many movements to make it feel more like you're on a track, but you don't feel like you're on a track. There's one scene in particular where you're dancing and your car's doing the waltz, and so you imagine it's a very smooth, kind of almost circular motion, but instead they're very abrupt, very isolated movements, and you feel like you're being jerked around, which, at least to me, never really felt like I'm dancing. It feels like I'm just being tossed around, and the movements when you're not dancing, when you're just kind of driving around, they feel very much like someone just kind of jerking the steering wheel back and forth, like you're in a racing game, which I suppose does feel kind of like a runaway car. But I think that however they calibrated those movements, they don't feel as well programmed. They feel more random. They feel more off-putting. It makes for a less fun ride experience, at least for me. And maybe it's the same and I'm just biased because I don't like the ride itself. I don't think there's enough substance to it. But I think that shows just how much of a difference the way that you program the same car. I mean, it's basically the same car, the same technology, but if you program it just a little bit differently, it can drastically change everything about a ride, I think. But I think it shows that in order for a ride to be successful, you need more than just a good piece of technology, because there are some rides that are using very old technology. Like Pirates of the Caribbean is not necessarily the newest technology. It's pretty old technology. It's a boat ride on a track in the water. The animatronics are very cartoonish. It's not a new ride. It doesn't have those new projection faces, but that's okay because it doesn't need it. It's an entertaining ride, even without the technology. Whereas I think Runaway Railway lands on the other side, where it has a lot of technology, but I don't really think it has that heart. It doesn't feel like it's a good ride. Pirates of the Caribbean was originally supposed to be a walkthrough attraction. And so I think that when you look at it through that lens, it makes sense that it is good without the technology, because it wasn't necessarily supposed to have that to begin with. You're just walking through the attraction. And so I think that means that if you add a boat ride, it's more efficient, it's more convenient, but it's not necessarily going to elevate the ride. But that's okay, because the ride could have existed without that. And I think it's the same thing with Rise of the Resistance, where you have that technology, but you also have that creative storytelling and set building and that full experience, where I think if you were to walk through Rise of the Resistance, you would definitely probably lose some of that plot, because it's more of a linear storytelling narrative. You'd have to be able to walk at the same speed as the cars. But I think that you could, even if you didn't hear the story, there's plenty to look at, there's plenty to do. If you would have to walk in and sit down in the escape pod, similar to how Tower of Terror works, I think it would still be just as fun an experience, and the ride vehicle elevates it. Whereas I feel like Runaway Railway almost doesn't have much of an experience without being in the car, because the experience is the car. And so if it were a walkthrough, which is,
oh, this is cool looking, but there's not much to do.
And so I think that kind of shows, again, you need every element of the ride, not just the vehicle, to be a full experience. And I think that's, to me, what shows the difference. I mean, it shows the difference in popularity, because Runaway Railway has long lines for sure, but they're not as long as Rise of the Resistance, which has had to move to boarding groups because they can't even have a line, so they have lines stretching through the whole land, and then they empty them out and then fill them again, because they can't have a regular line because there's not enough room in the land. And I think that's because they were able to create a more cohesive experience. And these things are expensive. They're hard to build. They're expensive. They break down all the time. I actually got evacuated because it broke down while I was there. I couldn't film it, obviously, because we were going backstage. But it happens pretty frequently, to the point when they had a route that didn't even actually bring us necessarily backstage. We just went through like a pathway that we weren't supposed to go down. And so I think that they understand that that's going to break down, because it's just a massive ride. It's basically 4 rides. It's very, very complicated. But I think that when you do that, when you have the kind of ingenuity and you have the creative freedom to be able to build a ride where every single element works on its own and works if the show lights are on, if the soundtrack isn't there, if you're walking through the scenery, if you remove a single element of it, it still works. And I think that can't necessarily be said about Broadway Railway, but almost can with Pirates of the Caribbean. I think if you were to ride through Pirates of the Caribbean with just the music, just the sound design, I feel like it would work. If you were to ride through Pirates of the Caribbean without the music and just seeing the scenes, I think it would work. I think if you were to walk through Pirates of the Caribbean, it would work. And I don't think you can say that with Runaway Railway. Now, this isn't me just doing a video saying
Broadway Railway is the worst attraction ever exists.
I don't think that would be Superstar Limo. But I do think that it is kind of indicative of a larger trend where the overall experience looks kind of okay until you start to dissect it and realize that it's only okay when you're looking at the sum total of it. And I think that that's, to me, why some attractions in Disney, and I'm using Runaway Railway as a good example of that, don't feel as good as other attractions, because other attractions have more of a cohesive feel where all of the elements are good and work together. But also, what do I know? I don't create rides. Unless Disney owns Lucasfilm, which made Indiana Jones. They already have several instances of Indiana Jones in their theme parks. Disneyland has an Indiana Jones Adventure, whereas Walt Disney World has the Indiana Jones stunt show, but no theme park attractions. So I think it would be really cool if they built a version of the Indiana Jones Adventure in Disney World, but with a trackless system. So basically copy and paste Runaway Railway, but make it Indiana Jones themed. And then you can make that ride. So you can go past the boulder, but you can actually try to run out of the way, and you can speed up, and you can rotate, and you can go through these scenes, and you can have the score from the movies going through the rooms, and you can hear various different sound design. You can feel the wind on your face. You can smell the things going on around you. You can make it something that's to the level of Rise of the Resistance, so it's not the only theme park attraction that has that kind of weight. But it's a ride that has different elements that all work together, instead of needing the elements to work together to be a good attraction. Anyway, I just kind of rambled for a long time. I think that's kind of going to be the format from now on for Alphabet Extras. I think that next week we're going to be back to the normal show with a full episode on theme parks. Maybe not. Who knows at this point? Schedules are confusing. And then after that theme park episode will, probably at some point be an episode on remakes and reboots, but who's to say?